Rewriting history. The writing of Indian history underwent a significant transformation under British colonial rule. The British, with their own agenda, sought to document and interpret India's past in a way that aligned with their colonial objectives. Prior to this period, Indian historical narratives were primarily based on oral traditions, religious texts, and local chronicles. These sources, rich in cultural and regional diversity, offered a multifaceted view of India's past, reflecting the subcontinent's complex and varied history. These sources presented a diverse and often fragmented picture of the subcontinent's past. Each region had its own stories, heroes, and historical events, contributing to a rich tapestry of narratives that were deeply rooted in local traditions and beliefs. The British, however, sought to create a unified and coherent narrative that served their colonial interests. They aimed to establish a version of history that justified their rule and portrayed them as the bringers of order and civilization to a supposedly chaotic land. This new narrative often privileged written sources over oral ones and interpreted historical events through a distinctly European lens. The British historians emphasized written records, often dismissing oral traditions and local accounts as unreliable or primitive. This shift in historiography had a profound impact on how Indians viewed their own past. The colonial narrative began to dominate educational curricula and public discourse, reshaping the collective memory and identity of the Indian people. The colonial narrative often portrayed India as a land of ancient wisdom, but also of inherent stagnation and internal divisions. This duality served to highlight the supposed need for British intervention and governance. This view justified British rule by presenting it as a necessary force for progress and modernization. The British depicted themselves as the harbingers of modernity, bringing infrastructure, education, and governance to a land they claimed was in dire need of reform. The Aryan Invasion theory emerged within this context, becoming a powerful tool for shaping perceptions of India's history and identity. This theory suggested that the Indian subcontinent was shaped by waves of invasions and migrations, particularly by the so-called Aryans. The theory, with its roots in linguistic studies, proposed that a race of nomadic warriors called Aryans invaded India around 1500 BCE. This narrative was constructed using linguistic similarities between Sanskrit and European languages, suggesting a common origin. These invaders, believed to be of Indo-European origin, were credited with bringing Sanskrit, the Vedas, and the foundations of Hinduism to the subcontinent. This interpretation positioned the Aryans as the bearers of a superior culture and civilization. This narrative, however, had far-reaching consequences, creating a sharp divide between the supposedly Aryan north and the Dravidian south. The British used this division to further their policy of divide and rule, exacerbating regional and cultural differences. This division, though largely artificial, continues to influence social and political discourse in India today. The legacy of the colonial historiography and the Aryan invasion theory still echoes in contemporary debates about identity, culture, and history in India. The seeds of the Aryan invasion theory can be traced back to the work of 19th-century linguist Max Muller. I proposed the existence of two Aryan races, an eastern branch that migrated to India and a western branch that populated Europe. I based my theory on the striking similarities I observed between Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, and European languages like Latin, Greek, and German. I hypothesized that these languages shared a common ancestor, which I termed Proto-Indo-European. I believed that this ancestral language originated in Central Asia and spread outwards through migrations. While Muller's work laid the foundation for the field of Indo-European linguistics, his theory of two Aryan races was later appropriated to support the idea of an Aryan invasion of India. Muller's linguistic hypothesis, while groundbreaking at the time, was based on limited evidence and relied heavily on speculation. He himself cautioned against drawing simplistic conclusions about race and migration from linguistic data. However, his work was quickly seized upon by colonial administrators and historians in India, who saw in it a convenient framework for explaining the diversity of the subcontinent's population. The concept of an Aryan invasion provided a seemingly scientific basis for existing racial hierarchies and reinforced the notion of European cultural superiority. The Aryan invasion theory gained significant traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the work of British colonial administrators and historians like Herbert Hope Risley and Bishop Robert Caldwell. These individuals were instrumental in shaping the narrative that would influence generations to come. I played a key role in developing the concept of racial classification in India. My work was not just academic. It had real-world implications for how people were categorized and treated. I used anthropometric measurements, particularly nasal indices, to divide the Indian population into distinct racial categories. These measurements were seen as scientific proof of inherent differences between groups. My work was heavily influenced by the prevailing racial theories of the time, which placed Europeans at the top of a racial hierarchy. These theories were widely accepted in Europe and were used to justify colonial rule. I argued that the Aryan invaders were a taller, fairer-skinned people who had intermingled with the indigenous population to varying degrees. This intermingling, I suggested, was responsible for the diverse physical characteristics seen across India. This mixing, I claimed, accounted for the physical and cultural diversity of the Indian subcontinent. It was a convenient explanation that fit neatly into the colonial agenda of divide and rule. I further solidified the Aryan-Dravidian divide through my work on Dravidian languages. My research suggested that these languages were fundamentally different from those spoken in the north. I argued that these languages, spoken primarily in South India, belonged to a distinct language family unrelated to the Indo-European family. This linguistic distinction was used to support the idea of a separate Dravidian race. This linguistic division was then mapped onto a racial and cultural divide, reinforcing the notion of a historical and cultural chasm between North and South India. This idea had far-reaching implications for how people in these regions viewed themselves and each other. The work of Risley, Caldwell, and others served to solidify the Aryan invasion theory as the dominant narrative of Indian history. This narrative was taught in schools and became a part of the collective consciousness. Their theories, though lacking in rigorous scientific evidence, were widely disseminated through textbooks, official reports, and popular literature. These publications were influential in shaping public opinion and academic discourse. This narrative had a lasting impact on Indian society, shaping perceptions of identity, culture, and even politics. It influenced how people saw themselves and each other, creating divisions that persist to this day. The legacy of Risley and Caldwell's work is a reminder of the power of narrative in shaping history and society. In recent decades, advancements in genetics have challenged the fundamental tenets of the Aryan invasion theory. This theory, which has long been a cornerstone of historical narratives about the Indian subcontinent, posits that a group of Indo-European-speaking people, known as the Aryans, invaded and settled in India around 1500 BCE. However, modern genetic research is painting a very different picture. Genetic studies, particularly those focusing on mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down maternally, and Y chromosome DNA, Y-DNA, which is inherited paternally, have provided valuable insights into the ancestry of the Indian population. These genetic markers allow scientists to trace lineage and migration patterns over thousands of years. And Y chromosome DNA, Y-DNA, have provided valuable insights into the ancestry of the Indian population. By analyzing these genetic markers, researchers can reconstruct the demographic history of populations and understand how different groups have interacted over time. These studies have consistently shown a high degree of genetic continuity within the subcontinent, dating back tens of thousands of years. This continuity suggests that the people of the Indian subcontinent have deep-rooted genetic ties to the region, far predating the supposed Aryan invasion.
This genetic evidence strongly suggests that the Indian population is largely indigenous. The genetic data indicates that the majority of the Indian gene pool has remained relatively stable over millennia, with only minor contributions from external populations, and that there was no significant influx of genes from outside the subcontinent during the time period associated with the Aryan invasion. This challenges the traditional narrative of a large-scale migration or invasion, bringing new genetic material into the region. While there is evidence of gene flow between India and other regions, this flow appears to have been bidirectional and gradual, occurring over millennia rather than through a sudden invasion. Trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchanges facilitated this genetic mixing, rather than a single dramatic event. For example, a landmark study published in the journal Nature in 2019 analyzed the genomes of over 500 individuals from across India. This comprehensive study provided a detailed genetic map of the Indian population, offering new insights into its complex history. The study found no evidence of a large-scale migration from Central Asia into India during the time period proposed for the Aryan invasion. Instead, the genetic data suggested a more nuanced picture of gradual and continuous gene flow. Instead, the researchers concluded that the genetic makeup of the Indian population is best explained by a model of long-term genetic continuity within the subcontinent. This model aligns with the archaeological and linguistic evidence, which also points to a deep and continuous presence of indigenous populations in the region.
These genetic findings have profound implications for our understanding of Indian history and identity. They suggest that the cultural and genetic heritage of the Indian subcontinent is deeply rooted in its own soil, rather than being primarily shaped by external influences. They undermine the very foundation of the Aryan invasion theory, suggesting that the theory is more myth than reality. This new understanding encourages a re-evaluation of historical narratives and highlights the importance of indigenous contributions to the rich tapestry of Indian civilization.